Tonight's featured panel, A Seat at the Table, will explore the interplay between cities and the international world order. Please welcome your moderator, Gillian Tett, U.S. Editor-at-Large, Financial Times. Former Mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel. Abha Joshi Ghani of the World Bank. Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. Aromar Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. And Fernando, Medina, Mayor of Lisbon.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And we've just had both a chilling diagnosis of the challenges that are facing some of you, but also a rousing call to arms. And as the previous speaker said, in many ways, the solutions to these challenges lie in the hands of the mayors and the cities. So we have two current mayors and one former mayor with us right now to give us all the answers, to enable us to sleep well at night and reassure us. I'd like perhaps to start with you, Mayor Emanuel, and ask, you're no longer in the hot seat, so hopefully you can now speak incredibly...
After tonight, that is.
You can hopefully speak incredibly frankly and honestly about what you think.
Oh, that would be unusual for me.
Well, let it rip. Yeah. Let it rip. I mean, do you think it's reasonable to be looking to mayors today to provide leadership on these issues, which are fundamentally national and international in their nature?
Well, the short answer is yes and no. On the yes part, I mean, I do agree with the former speaker. It's kind of what my book's about, is that we're going to look back.
So you're writing a book, we should explain that to the audience.
Right, the folks from Chicago, at least, know that there's a receding of the nation state and the emergence of a city state. We are now more intimate, immediate, and impactful on our local situation and government. At least here, it's not different than Brussels, but Washington is Disneyland on the Potomac. It's not really handling issues. Ideas today move horizontally, not vertically. We'll share ideas of different things. Fernando and I were talking about housing issues, transportation issues. There are things that we're doing today. On the prior forum last year, we talked about family and parenting and counseling, and there's certain things we've done on early childhood to do also parenting counseling and guidance. So ideas move horizontally where they in the past used to move vertically. Now, you have a major event like a healthcare crisis that is more of a public health crisis. Cities are prepared but not capable on their own to handle that. Climate change, there's a void, and every one of us, the Mayor Fernando and I met in Paris at a conference there on climate change. We had a Chicago Climate Charter Conference. 86 cities have signed on to that individually customized plan to get to Paris 2025. So in one way, I would say we're doing it and doing more of it than ever before, but there are certain crises that happen that you cannot do it without a national government as a partner, but there is really an absent partner.
Right.
So I would say it's more yes than no, but there's a no part to it.
Right. Well, you're being unusually modest in not explaining to everyone that you have a book coming out at the end of the year or early next year on
that was a slow pitch
issue.
Over the center, so I decided to take it.
Yeah, well, so you have a book laying out these ideas coming out later this year or early next year. And I'm curious, today in America, where there is such visceral distrust in Washington, such frustration with the federal government, it's very easy to argue that cities are the main engine of activity and innovation. I'm curious about you, Martin, because you represent Bristol, which is that the third or fourth largest city in the UK?
It's one of the 10 core cities, one of the 10 biggest cities outside London.
Okay, one of the 10 biggest cities, one of the 10 cool cities. And yet, obviously, the UK does not really have a federal structure. It's much more clearly centralised. Would you agree that you are at the forefront of dealing with the challenges today in Bristol?
I say we should be. I mean, that question that you talked about, democratic legitimacy, I just rank that alongside climate change, migration, inequality, among a list of global challenges, or a list of challenges that cities all over the world are facing, that national governments working alone are showing themselves unable to deliver on. And it is one, I think, where city leadership is closer to people and can get things done like that. What I don't want to do is sit here and say this is the answer to all the world's ills. But there is another voice of governance that needs to be included in the systems of global governance that have not been systematically included so far. And that is the voice of city leaders. But I would add to that the leaders of networks of cities. So what I'm not talking about is just having Bristol at the table. It has to be Bristol speaking in cooperation with Chicago, with Lisbon, with Paris, with Freetown, and coming with beginning to develop a shared global urban voice.
Right. I mean, Fernando, Medina, you've been already liaising with some of the other mayors. I was just hearing backstage about how you've been talking about climate change and looking for shared solutions. How much of your focus today is just on Lisbon, and how much are you looking out to connect with other mayors?
We connect a lot, and because we need it. Basically, we are facing the same challenges. We have naturally different situations on departure, different frameworks to act, and the dimension of each challenge is different, but basically we are facing the same. Climate change is happening now, and is happening, and it will affect people, humans. Climate change is not a problem of the planet. The planet was here much before. It has seen a lot of changes on temperature, on a millennial basis. The question is about human life and our ability to live well. So all of us are dealing with the same problems. How can we tackle reducing emissions, putting a carbon neutral cities? How can we capture emissions? So everyone is dealing more or less with the same problems, with different realities. So we learn a lot. Like Rahm said, the information now is more horizontal in the sense I want to know what he's doing. I want to know what Paris is doing, what London is doing. We just copy ideas, and that's very good.
Right. I'm curious. I mean, I'm going to turn to Abha and Aromar in a moment, but given that you all three are deeply engaged in the issue on climate change, which of course is particularly interesting in America given that the federal government has taken a different stance, do you think it was a mistake that the Paris Accord was essentially driven by agreements between nation states? Should they have had cities, municipalities, smaller regions involved in the Paris Accord?
Well, you know, let me say one thing. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion on climate change. Yes, the short answer to your question is yes. Because when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, cities, whether it's in office buildings, big housing, cars, is a big contributor, but also has the bigger play in solving that problem. Our issues, while we deal with climate change, I don't want to speak for the other mayors, I would guarantee you a bigger bulk of our time is on housing, education, transportation, and quality of life issues, of which climate change has an impact on it. I think, and I would not want to say this so it's misinterpreted, that is one of a series of issues that we talk about, but I would say you could have a whole day conference just on the issue of housing and what's happening in our economies and the impact on families, transportation, and making neighborhoods and cities viable. And that, as a former mayor, that consumed not an inordinate, a bulk of the time where climate change was a key issue. Look, when I became mayor, Chicago had 2 coal plants operating. We were the last big city in America with 2 coal plants, and we had a major public health issue in and around Pilsen and Little Village. But the big major issue is housing, transportation, education, quality of life, affordability of living in a city that is now getting priced out of existence for working families.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say it's the conversation we have in the city that we have to deliver on, you know, many fronts at the same time, not just a single issue. On that point you make there about climate change, one of the points I've made is that actually we need to give people the economic space, the emotional space to think about existential threats that are 10, 15, 20 years away. If they're worried about where they're going to sleep tonight, where their children are going to sleep, and if they're going to feed their children tomorrow, then we don't create space for an environmental movement that's inclusive of everyone, including the poorest people. It just becomes a middle-class pursuit that's pursued and imposed on populations. But that's where cities become important, because they are working on all those fronts at the same time and creating the conditions for success to be more rather than less likely.
Right. Abha, I mean, from the perspective of the World Bank, again, the World Bank has traditionally dealt with nation states. You are doing more micro-level work now, but do you think that the policy direction needs to tilt towards dealing more directly with cities and trying to create networks of cities in the way that the mayors are talking about?
No, thank you. Thank you for that question. Because I think that, you know, institutions like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, if you take these multilateral organizations, they were created at a time when the idea was to deal just with nation states. So cities were not a part of that equation or paradigm. But let me say that that has not restricted us from dealing with cities. So we may go through the national government, but especially in the urban space, we are dealing directly with cities. And given that there are some, you know, 70,000 odd cities in this world, you know, increasingly we are dealing with a set of cities or looking at regional programs. And, you know, in addition to lending, I think our key aspect of our support to cities is really in capacity building, you know, be it governance and institutional strengthening and regulations. So, you know, I think it's very, very important to bring that side of cities up, because at the end of the day, if cities are to lead, then they should be able to raise finances and meet their own agenda in terms of investments and not be totally dependent on national funds coming down to them. But I wanted to just step back a little and say that, you know, we heard from both the mayors here that cities are not just dealing with climate change or migration, you know, so we know today that urban space is really a space where all development challenges meet, you know, be it migration, climate change, social, housing, inequality, exclusion, crime. But cities are also spaces which can actually give solutions to these. So if, you know, I'm not going to go into the numbers, but you have, you know, the 80% of GHG emissions, but also 80% of GDP contribution from cities all over the world. So, you know, and I also want to put it to everybody that it's not a homogeneous ecosystem. So you can talk about cities like Chicago and Bristol and London and Lisbon and so on, and having a voice at the table. We're also talking about cities which do not even have a voice at the national level. Even in large democracies, cities come way down, even though cities are where the government actually meets the citizens and where actual solutions happen. And they are talking the talk and walking the walk, and the action is there. So
absolutely, yeah, well that picks up on Emanuel's point about, you know, the immediacy of cities and the fact you actually had this intimate connection between voters and citizens and the organs of government. But I'm curious how this works in India, because India is a place of incredible growth, urbanization. In many ways you epitomize the trend towards urbanization. You're dealing with a very messy federal structure where federal political processes often don't work. Do you see more reason to be optimistic about the cities in India than the federal national level?
Of course, I mean, you know, India can't transform unless our urbanization transforms the country. But remember, we are a 2/3 rural and a 1/3 urban country. So India's transformation is fundamentally a cultural transformation. And, you know, to pick up on what the mayor said just now, that is a big change. So in some senses, whether it's climate change or it's dealing with the question of employment, cities are the places where we're actually going to find that shift taking place. Like we did in Europe a century ago, we've seen in the Americas over the last 100 years or so. The question is, how does one do that in a 21st century frame? In which, like Mayor Emanuel was saying, the role of the nation state is actually shifting. And I think part of this requires a new imagination. Cities were there before the first nation states were created, before the first firms were created in some senses. So we have a long history in our parts of the world to actually draw upon, to look at where these shifts can actually take place, both in the politics and the economics, and in the cultural imagination.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I happen to do my PhD in Central Asia, and if anyone who's studied Central Asian history, which is a very small minority of people, but in this room anyway, will know that Central Asian history is a story of city-states, and that was the unit of government. And I often think we're going back to the future. I also think that one of the worst things that was ever done was calling the United Nations, not the United Entities. But I'm curious though, because one of the interesting things that came out when I was writing the column for the supplement about the growing role of cities, the ambition of cities, came from an interview I had with the mayor of Milan, who pointed out to me that there's a common thread in Europe, which I'm sure that you'll feel in Lisbon as well, that cities are becoming the bastion of liberal values, if you like. And that's partly because cities are the winners of globalization, often, not always, but the winners tend to be found in cities. And in a place like Italy, the mayor of Milan would argue that actually there's a real split between the liberal, more left-wing or centrist politics of cities and the hinterland. Do any of you have any thoughts? I'm sure it's the same in Portugal too, and in some ways it's the same in the UK with Brexit. Do any of you have any thoughts about how to bridge that great divide? And is that going to get bigger in the coming years? Well, basically the rural-urban is actually adding to the sense of polarization.
Well, I mean, I don't know if anybody else will.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily agree with you there. What we just saw before we came on was the dark side of cities.
Yeah.
And for all of history, cities have actually concentrated risk and poverty and unemployment. So the interesting thing for us is, and that's why mayors and city leaders are so important, is actually turning things around, because they are places of tremendous opportunity. But you have to balance the dark side with the opportunity. I think that is the question, that's a political moment, that's a question of structure, that's a question of imagination and getting the systems right.
Well, first of all, I mean, if you look at any election, at least in the States, but if you also look at the Brexit outcome, there is a different economics between urban and rural. If you were thinking from a national political standpoint, you would not let that dichotomy hold. And if you actually look at where, let's just take the recent election, Democrats were successful, they actually outperformed in rural areas, not just did well in urban. And I think one of the things that I think people are yearning for right now is somebody that can find common foundations and areas. I think there's a set of issues on transportation, education, health access, and healthcare that you can actually find a commonality that would actually not allow that bridge. The bridge can be there. A successful national politician or elected official and party is one that finds enough to find common foundation in that area. So I don't accept, now, there is a reaction in the rural areas because they feel forgotten and not heard.
Yeah.
One of the things a successful elected official does is make sure that people's voices are heard and they feel counted in that debate. That can also happen, I want to say this, in an urban setting as well. It's not just restricted to urban versus rural. That is when you're thinking of it from a national level.
I mean, Martin, you are in a particularly interesting situation because you have stood up very proudly and said, I champion immigration, refugees, an open city, even though at the moment one's dealing with Brexit. And I think you came out and said that you wanted to essentially, have an open for business international perspective to Bristol, even amid Brexit. Do you feel that tension?
I don't feel so first of all, I think part of that kind of rural-urban split comes because people create a framework for people to approach the world through that kind of zero-sum conflict. Right. Cities are not making rural areas poorer. It's the way the global economy's been putting itself out. That's not the fault of cities. And in my city, Bristol is a very wealthy place. We got a fantastic story to tell to the world about tech and aerospace, and a third of the world's natural history broadcasting comes through the city. We've got 25% of my kids in poverty. Seventh worst city in the UK to be born black in. One of the worst cities to be born poor in. So we hold these inequalities within the city, a very different experience of city life as well. So you've got to take both sides of it. It's just not that simple. In fact, CNN did a piece the other day, and they butchered it, to be honest. because I started.
Tell us how you really feel.
Well,
If in doubt, blame the journalist. I think that's another theme.
No, we can
Hey, wait,
all agree
wait.
on that.
Yeah, exactly. You can all agree that I'm going to be target
Please don't
practice.
be a wounded journalist. But honestly, I started off by talking about the top side of Bristol, but I always say Bristol's got this great story to tell, but tens of thousands of people are not the start of it. They then did a piece on Brexit saying, with me saying all the wonderful things about Bristol, and then they cut it there and they went to all the poverty in the rural area. That's a really poor piece of journalism, and it set a framework for people thinking that that is the way the world is understood. Some of the other divides as well. I mean, I am supportive of migration. I am the result of migration. My dad was a 12-year-old, came from Jamaica. My mum, white. My grandfather came from South Wales and Ireland before that. I am the product of it, so I don't think it's an issue. And dynamic identities that are multidimensional are not a problem if people are equipped with the skills and a sense of self to be able to live with that. Unfortunately, with the Twitterization of our civic discourse, everything's becoming of one dimension and people can't cope with difference and change, and that's an issue. If I can just say one thing I think fundamentally about cities, cities only exist because stuff moves and crosses over. If stuff doesn't move, cities begin to die. Our challenge as a city is not to stop stuff moving like national governments want to do. Our challenge as cities is to say, how can we best position ourselves with the skills and resources to be able to take advantage of movement rather than just trying to stop it?
Right. Abha, and then I'd like to bring Mayor Fernando.
I just wanted to add that, so mostly in keeping with what Marvin just said, is that the urban-rural dichotomy is a false dichotomy. We cannot look at cities as islands. They do connect back to the agricultural towns, and that's how things move, and that's how value chains and supply chains are formed. And I think what is interesting is that national governments have taken advantage of creating this rural-urban divide. And I think that's where cities have to rise up. And also, I think it's really important that, there's this whole migration of people from rural to urban areas or to cities. And it's not a push factor unless it's in a conflict or a zone or somewhere where there are floods and droughts or climate change. But it's a pull factor of people looking for those ladders of opportunities. It is well known now that there is no future in rural poverty, that every path to prosperity goes through cities. So how do national governments today empower those cities? And although, cities have a voice at the table mostly through networks, I also wanted to raise it to the three mayors. There is a plethora of networks. So how do you actually say, if we want a dominant hard voice at this table, which network is going to be
Well, I'd love to ask that to Mayor Fernando. Which networks do you take part in internationally to learn about what's happening in other cities? And do you feel that they are effective at actually coordinating a voice?
Let me just go a little back to the previous question, because in fact it is true that global cities are raising their importance and they are very connected. In the sense, a young people from a Portuguese university is connected with some guy that is in New York University or in Chicago or in Seattle, LA, and definitely he has traveled to Madrid, Barcelona, Milan or Shanghai, because they do that. And young people, much different from my generation, and I'm 45, they don't want to buy cars, they don't want to buy houses, they don't want to be strings attached, and they are very moving, and they are always connected. So universities are connected, research centers are connected, multinational corporations are connecting, tourism is connecting people. So this type of movement still exists. In fact, and this is the bone of the growth of global cities. But at the same time, is inside the cities, those same cities that we face much more severe exclusion problems that you face in rural areas. Because the question is that, the difficulty is that as we are more successful or putting our cities in the global area and being more competitive and more able to allow jobs well paid, the gap between those guys with opportunities and no opportunities inside our cities is going to enlarge. And the question is that we have all the reality in the same city. For instance, Lisbon, in the strictest sense, is a small city in area, 100 square kilometers. We have global companies. I'm here talking to you, here in Chicago. I have neighborhoods where I have to deal with early school leavers at the age of 16, and they have risks of dropping out schools. It's 100 square kilometers. So the idea that there is a conflict between cities and rural areas, that's not a big split.
Right.
That it is not a big split. The split it's even inside cities more difficult to solve. Very soon, I think the most dynamic networks now deal with climate change. I think they have, because in climate change, in climate action, you take care of everything. You take care of transports, housing, energy production, social inclusion, because social inclusion is critical. Climate change does not affect people in the same way. So I think the most dynamic networks are in our days connecting in all around.
That's interesting. I think that's my impression as well, but would you agree?
Climate change is received appropriately the amount of energy from an international standpoint. Our systems are different, but if you got mayors together in the States, they would be immediately talking about education or transportation. And so it depends on what type of forum and what type of topic. You get the mayors of the 50 biggest cities in the United States, it's going to be centered on education and transportation, and then probably housing and quality of life issues. And how you fund education, and that's why, getting back to your question about the dichotomy of the split, it's a framework to understand stuff. But I will tell you this, a parent in rural America, and I just coming from a bike trip, has the same aspirations, same hopes, same fears, same sense of urgency for their kids as a parent in a city. And if you talk about the aspirations for your children, it doesn't have a geographic split.
Absolutely.
And so I think it is more of a way of understanding the world, but if you break down those kind of paradigm, you'll actually see the aspirations and hopes are no different. And finding a language that brings people together and finding a common aspiration is the best way you're going to find actually solutions to political problems.
Well, let's hope so. We have time for a couple of questions, and I'm conscious that in the audience there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about these issues. So if anyone would like to ask a question, we have 2 microphones in the aisles, one there and one over there. And we are using the microphones this year, not passing around microphones. So if anyone would like to ask a question or raise a point. Everyone needs some alcohol or some wine to start with. Question there, and I think do we have a way to get the mic, because it's quite hard for them to get out. Okay, thank you.
Hello, Arturo Cervantes from Mexico, and thank you for the opportunity to make a question. More and more cities throughout Central South America and developing countries are experiencing extreme forces derived from international providers. For example, guns. You have in Latin America 50 of the most dangerous countries, 50 of the most dangerous cities throughout the world are in Central America. Why are they so dangerous? And if we look at other cities in North America and in European, more developed economies, which have the companies which are producing the goods, which are producing the chaos and the deaths and the violence, how is this international relation to play forward in Agenda 2030? If you really are interested in city growth,
right.
These issues on international commerce should be part of the equation.
Right. Mayor Emanuel.
I think, you know, there was some recent articles here nationally about the amount of what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Mexico, and also in Central America. And you have 2 major forces, which are guns and drugs, or narcotics. Not the sole forces, but those are a big element in the forces. And the international narcotics effort, and this is an example where we can talk about the importance of a city, but without a national government and international cooperation, you're not going to solve these problems. They're too big for one municipality to handle on their own in that effort.
If I can say, I think that's an example of why we need cities to have that influence. I'm thinking from my Bristol, we begin to talk about devolution in the UK now. We're the most centralised country in Europe, and you devolve power to cities to have more control over what goes on inside their boundaries. You know, that's what it says on the tin anyway. It doesn't always work like that. But what cities also need is the power to shape the context within which they have to operate, because that context impacts on what goes on in cities. You can't roll down responsibility within your own little bubble when you've got all these forces coming from outside you and you've had no opportunity to speak into them and shape global policy. So we had this discussion just this afternoon about how do you move global governance into its next iteration, where the leaders of cities and networks of cities are equal partners to national leaders in shaping national and international policy.
Well, I can see lots of hands waving now. We've got a question there, and then back there. And I'll ask you actually, because we have only got a few minutes left, to be brief in the question.
Ron from DePaul University in Chicago. As you describe the rural-urban difference and the rise of populism, is it different from, what is the role of culture and history, or does it all just plain come down to economics?
Wow.
Well, I think if you look at our last election in 2016, it would be a mistake to think it only through the prism of economics. First of all, because Fernando and I were talking about this a little earlier, you are experiencing a middle class revolt, while a lot of the discussion appropriately on a policy level is about income inequality. A middle class revolt had to do with a certain sense of disrespect that was happening to them, their children, and their aspirations, and to think that you can only see this through the prism of economics, short of culture, is to misunderstand the sense of grievance that has been built up, at least in the United States over the last 20 years, where middle class feel that the elite have one rule book that applies to them and another rule book that applies to them and the middle class and their children that's totally different. And I think there's a big cultural element to this to understand populism. And if you only looked at it from economics, you'd be missing a big piece of the conversation.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I would imagine you'd say the same thing in Europe, would you?
I mean, I think one of the rise of populism, and if I look in the UK, if I can just chuck this one among many other, is the struggle of white identity. People don't know, white English people don't know what their identity is. And some other groups, like the Welsh, Irish, Scots, they've had to fight for their identity, migrant groups, and I think that in the face of that, as society begins to change, they say, who am I? What's my story? What am I a part of? And some people are picking up on that sense of lostness, as well as their sense of alienation from globalization.
We've actually got a question right at the back there. I think we should waiting patiently first, and then
Gloria Castillo from Chicago United. We've been presented with two facts. One is the rise of nationalism, and the second is the increase of refugees moving around the world. Are cities prepared with infrastructure to deal with the movement of refugees into your cities, and how are you looking at housing, healthcare, care of children that are moving across borders? We're seeing, I think, a real humanitarian crisis in the United States at our border, and certainly there may be other implications that we're not aware of on a global basis. Right. Are cities prepared?
Great question. I think since we are so short of time, I might take your question as well and see whether there's any overlap, or we can wrap them together for last comment.
No overlap on that one.
No overlap. Okay. Well, in that case, we may have to skip.
Can I take that one? I think nationalism is a self-defeated approach when you take 2 or 3 nationalists. Let's talk about Europe. Do you know what are the worst adversaries of the nationalists of Italy? It's the nationalists of Austria, because Italy says, I cannot take refugees, we have to share the burden for everyone, and Austria said, not in my country. Do you know what are the worst enemies of the Austrian nationalists? It's the Polish nationalists. because Austria says we need to get out and stay a little bit restrained against US and against European Union. We need to talk to Putin. Then go to a Polish elite and say Russia is our friend, not going to work. So nationalism is an ideology. There's another example. A lot of nationalism in Europe is about not putting more money or more power in the European Union. That's good for a nationalist in the north, in Milan, for instance. But a nationalist of 5 stars, the populist movement in the south, it's impossible because they said, no more money for me, I need more money in south of Italy. So at the end of the day, that discourse and that approach is mining confidence, but is self-defeating, because really in Europe, we have more the ability and more the means to solve the refugee crisis, because Europe is declining on population. We have a problem with population. We have a problem with the workforce, and the numbers that we are dealing in Europe are ridiculous. If you talk about 3 million people or 6 million people, for instance, you are talking about 2%, less than 2% of all the population. Let me just finish to give an example. My country, Portugal, a very small country in this context, we had 7 million people in 1974. We were the last European country to decolonize in Africa. And in 2 years, arrived to Portugal 700,000 people, 10% of all the population. What happened? Everyone was integrated. We have problems, yes, we had problems. We built houses, we built sanitary, we built water, everyone that was there. The problem of refugees is more the question of ideology, a question of lack of empathy, lack of ability of having a common approach, because in Portugal we need people. We have capacity of having refugees, but they don't arrive to Portugal. They are being closed in Italy or in other places before.
When Puerto Rico had their major weather event, Chicago took in 10,000 people from Puerto Rico. Housing, schools, healthcare, all went fine. We could meet that again at a certain level.
Well, I can see lots of hands are starting to raise. I see that everyone's trying to jump into this point, and that is exactly the right spirit, because it shows the conversation so far has started to really ignite passions. It's actually very nice to end on a positive note, because we are pretty much out of time, and to actually look at tangible examples where progress has been made, because what's become clear in the last couple of hours is, one, we are at a very interesting tipping point, or an interesting moment of change, as Mayor Emanuel said, in terms of the role of cities. The challenges are clearly huge. We had that very chilling set of nine challenges and very ominous looking dots on the graph. And yet there's clearly a spirit of cooperation and mutual learning and problem solving. So thank you all very much indeed for sharing your experiences. Best of luck to all of you for finding answers to these problems in the next couple of days for all of our benefits. And I will just say thank you and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much.